Welcome to the Professor English podcast, where we don't just talk about English, we practice using English. My name is Ryan, and I'm your host. Have you ever wanted to read an entire book in English? Have you ever thought about improving your English vocabulary through reading? If you answered yes to these questions, you are in the right place. In each episode of this podcast, we are going to explore the book 1984 by George Orwell, paragraph by paragraph. First, I will read the paragraph. Then we will examine the contents of the paragraph to make sure the meaning is clear. And then we will do a fluency and listening comprehension exercise to practice some of the interesting expressions and words that we find in the paragraph. Sound good? Great. Let's jump right in and take a look at the first paragraph of page 2 of 1984. But before we do, I just want to remind you that if you prefer a little visual help, you can find the video version of this podcast on my YouTube channel, Professor English ESL Class. This paragraph is pretty long, so I'm going to cover it in 2 episodes. This is the first half of the paragraph. Now on page 1, Winston is entering his apartment building and walking up to the 7th floor because the elevator is not working. In this paragraph, he is entering his apartment. Let's read the paragraph, and then we will talk about the meaning. Inside the flat, a fruity voice was reading out a list of figures which had something to do with the production of pig iron. The voice came from an oblong metal plaque, like a dulled mirror, which formed part of the surface of the right-hand wall. Winston turned a switch and the voice sank somewhat, though the words were still distinguishable. The instrument, the telescreen, it was called, could be dimmed, but there was no way of shutting it off completely. Now, I'm going to repeat the first sentence, which is, in the flat, a fruity voice was reading out a list of figures which had something to do with the production of pig iron. Describing a voice as fruity is not very common, and not really a word that you need to focus on. But just so we can understand the text completely, a fruity voice is a nice sounding voice. The nice voice was reading a list of figures. Figures is another word for numbers, so we can say the nice voice was reading a list of numbers, which had something to do with the production of pig iron. This phrase, "it had something to do with," is the phrase that we're going to practice today, so we will talk about it in detail in a few minutes. But for right now, let's say it means it was related to. So the fruity voice was on the TV and it was reading a list of numbers. And the numbers were related to or connected with the production of pig iron. Pig iron is a low-quality metal. The voice came from an oblong metal plaque. Oblong is a shape, like a square or a circle is a shape. Oblong means 2 sides are longer than 2 other sides are shorter. A square has equal sides. A rectangle is oblong because 2 of its sides are longer than the other 2 sides. A circle is even all around. An oval shape is oblong because 2 of its sides are longer. A plaque is something you usually put on a wall for decoration. The voice came from an oblong metal plaque on the wall. Picture a flat screen TV attached to the wall. This is what Orwell is describing, which is pretty amazing considering he wrote this story in 1949. Let's summarize what we've read up to now. There was a nice voice reading a list of numbers on the TV. The numbers were related to the production of a low-quality iron. They were talking about manufacturing and the numbers related to it. This TV is described as a dull mirror. The word dull is actually the opposite of sharp. It can also be used in situations when you expect something to be shiny, to reflect a lot of light. But it doesn't reflect light. If a mirror is clean, you will see bright, clear colors, and a lot of light can be reflected from the mirror. If the mirror is dirty, it will not reflect light, and the picture you see in the mirror will not be very clear. It will be dull. So this TV on the wall shows pictures, but the pictures are not very bright. They don't reflect a lot of light. The pictures are not very clear. Think of the old TVs from the 70s or before, if you can. Winston turned a switch, and the voice sank somewhat. Sink, sink, sank, sunk. Sink means go down. So when Winston turned the switch, the volume went down somewhat. The volume went down a little. The voice went down a little. Okay, let's review what we have so far. Winston enters the apartment building. Winston enters his apartment, and there's a nice sounding voice coming from the TV, which is attached to the wall. The voice is reading a list of numbers that are related to manufacturing, and actually the manufacturing of a very low quality product. The images on the TV are not very good quality. They are dull. So the TV doesn't give much light or clear definitions. Winston lowered the volume of the TV. The voice sank somewhat. It went down a little bit. But the words were still distinguishable. The volume was lowered, but you could still understand all of the words. Distinguishable here means each word was clear. So the words were still distinguishable means you can still understand each word. The instrument, the telescreen, it was called, could be dimmed. To dim means to lower the intensity of light. Dim is the opposite of bright. Bright means a lot of light. Dim means not very much light. When you enter a room, you can turn on the lights using a switch. We start with no light, and suddenly the room has much light. Some rooms have a dimmer switch. Instead of turning the lights on or off, you can use the dimmer switch to make the level of light very low or very high. The TV could be dimmed, but you could never shut it off completely. This means you have the option of making the light in the TV lower, but you don't have the option to turn off the TV. So you can make the light go down, but you can't shut off the TV. All right, let's summarize the paragraph one last time, and then let's focus on the phrase to have something to do with, which is a pretty interesting phrase. Winston enters the apartment. There's a TV on the wall. It's always playing. There's a nice voice on the TV, reading numbers, manufacturing numbers. The numbers describe the production of a low-quality iron. The images on the TV are not very clear, and it's impossible to turn the TV completely off. The only thing you can do is lower the volume and lower the light of the TV, but you can never turn it off. Now, let's take a closer look at this phrase. It had something to do with the production of pig iron. This phrase, it has something to do with, is a very common and useful phrase, which means it is connected to or related to something. Let's try an example to show you what I mean. If you want to be successful, you should take some risks. Okay, there are two parts here, all right? We're saying if you want success, you have to do this other thing, take risks. Maybe you don't understand why I say that. Maybe you say, well, I don't understand. What is the connection between being successful and taking risks? Okay. How can you make a question asking about the connection between taking risk and being successful? You can make the question by saying, what does taking risks have to do with being successful? That means, what is the connection? What does it have to do with being successful? It's possible to answer like this. Taking risks sometimes results in getting bigger rewards. Okay, that's maybe a typical answer. Taking risks is sometimes results in getting bigger rewards. But if you want to say the main focus, the main connection between taking risks and being successful, you can use have to do. It has to do with getting bigger rewards. That's the main connection. Okay, I know this is difficult, but let's try another one. Okay, if you want to be a good student, you have to manage your time well. Okay, so you have two things, being a good student, and I'm saying one thing you should do is manage your time well. But what if you don't understand how these two things are related? Maybe to you that doesn't make any sense, these two things. How are they connected? Why are you saying these things are connected somehow? How can you ask me to explain the relationship between managing time well and being a good student? What does being a good student have to do with managing time? What is the connection? What is the relationship between those two things? Or you can say, what does it have to do with managing time? What does being a good student have to do with managing time? What does it have to do with managing time? Now, if you want to give a neutral answer, you can just say that managing your time well makes you more efficient. But if you want to emphasize that the most important connection is making you more efficient, you can answer like this. It has to do with making you more efficient. So managing your time well has to do with making you more efficient. That's the most important relationship, the most important connection. Oh, this is pretty hard. Great job. Now, let's keep going. But before we do, I just want to take a moment to ask you a question. Do you find these exercises useful and helpful? If you answered yes to that question, then you should subscribe to this podcast to be sure that you don't miss the next helpful exercise. And if you're watching this on my YouTube channel, Professor English ESL class, don't forget to press the like button. It helps my channel a lot, and it lets me know you find this information helpful. Now, let's look at another example. Here is another two-part statement. If you want a promotion, you have to dress for success. If you want to get a promotion, you have to dress for success. Now, what if I tell you this and you say, well, I don't understand. I don't see the connection between the way you dress and getting a promotion. You want to know what is this connection between how you dress, dressing well, and getting a promotion? How would you ask me to explain the relationship? How would you tell me you want to know what the connection is? What does dressing well have to do with getting a promotion? What does dressing well have to do with getting a promotion? What is the connection? What is the relationship between these two things? What does dressing well have to do with getting a promotion? And if you're answering in a typical way, you can just say that dressing well projects a professional image. So, what does dressing well have to do with getting a promotion? Well, because dressing well projects a professional image. Now, if you wanted to say this is the most important connection, then you could use projecting a professional image. You could say it like this: it has to do with projecting a professional image. The connection is projecting a professional image. That's really super important in this. Okay, let's try one more two-part sentence, okay? If you want to lose weight, you should read food labels. If you want to lose weight, you should read food labels. Now, some people, if they hear that advice, they would think, oh, that doesn't seem connected. They don't seem related. So how would you ask someone, explain to me how these two things are related? Explain to me how reading food labels is connected to losing weight. What does reading food labels have to do with losing weight? What is the relationship? What is the connection? What does reading food labels have to do with losing weight? What does it have to do with losing weight? It is reading food labels. What does it have to do with losing weight? Now, if you're just giving a typical answer, you probably answer with because. Because labels help you understand the ingredients. Because labels help you understand ingredients. But if you want to, if you want this to be the most important thing, the most important connection, you could say it like this: it has to do with understanding ingredients. It has to do with understanding ingredients. All right, this was a hard one. This is pretty advanced English we're doing here. Okay, now let's revisit the original sentence, which was: a voice was reading a list of numbers. The numbers had something to do with the production of pig iron. In other words, the list of numbers was related to or connected to the production of iron. Now let's take a look at the word somewhat. It's a fairly common word, but not usually given any priority in ESL classes. So if you haven't seen this word before, it's very similar to saying a little or a little bit. Let's practice using it, okay? Here's a sentence. Mary is annoyed. Uh-oh. Let's make that a little softer by using somewhat. Remember, somewhat means a little bit. Mary is somewhat annoyed. Somewhat annoyed. Mary is somewhat annoyed. Because you already probably know the word annoyed, let's change that to a similar word you probably don't know, which is peeved. Mary is somewhat peeved. Okay, how would you make a why question with that sentence? Mary is somewhat peeved. Why is Mary somewhat peeved? Okay, let's say because her car would not start this morning. Mary is somewhat peeved because her car wouldn't start this morning. Mary is somewhat peeved because her car wouldn't start this morning. Let's try another example. John and Mark are anxious. John and Mark are anxious. Let's make that a little softer by adding the word somewhat. John and Mark are somewhat anxious. John and Mark are somewhat anxious. How would you make a why question with that sentence? Why are John and Mark somewhat anxious? Why are John and Mark somewhat anxious? Let's say because they're waiting for their final exam results. They're waiting for their final exam results. John and Mark are somewhat anxious because they're waiting for their final exam results. John and Mark are somewhat anxious because they're waiting for their final exam results. All right, super duper job. Let's try another example. But before we do, I would just like to remind you that if you found this exercise helpful, share it with your friends. And don't forget to like this video or subscribe to my channel. Now let's move on. The article was interesting. The article was interesting. Let's make that a little softer. It was interesting, but not extremely interesting. We can use somewhat. The article was somewhat interesting. The article was somewhat interesting. Now, let's make a why question with that sentence. Why was the article somewhat interesting? Why was the article somewhat interesting? Okay, and the answer is because it had some new information. The article was somewhat interesting because it had some new information. The article was somewhat interesting because it had some new information. All right, great job. Let's do one more. Yesterday was cold. Now let's make that softer by using the word somewhat. So it wasn't extremely cold, it was just a little cold. Yesterday was somewhat cold. Now let's make a why question. Why was yesterday somewhat cold? Why was yesterday somewhat cold? Okay, and here's the answer. Because it was the end of autumn. Because it was the end of autumn. Yesterday was somewhat cold because it was the end of autumn. Yesterday was somewhat cold because it was the end of autumn. Yesterday was somewhat cold because it was the end of autumn. Okay, great job. Now, let's revisit the original sentence, which was Winston turned a switch, and the voice sank somewhat. Sink means go down. Winston turned a switch, which lowered the volume. A little, not a lot, just a little. All right, amazing job. It's been really fun practicing English with you today, and I hope to see you again here soon. Now, this is a rather experimental way of exploring English, and it takes a lot of work. So if you want to see more videos like this, if you want to hear more podcasts like this, exploring English vocabulary and grammar using 1984, please leave a comment. Let me know that you find this helpful. So until the next paragraph, I'll see you again. Goodbye.